morning, Group B students. We're going to go ahead and start off today by doing our bell work, simplifying those algebraic expressions, kind of like we talked about last week on Friday and Monday. Simplifying expressions means combining like terms. So I can combine my w to the fifths. Negative 7 plus 9 is 2w to the fifth. W to the third and w to the third, those can combine. 3 minus 5 is negative 2, w to the third. I don't have anything else with just a w, so I'm just going to leave the 4w. And then negative 6 and negative 3, those are constants. They don't have any letters with them, so they can combine. Negative 6 minus 3 is negative 9. And that is our simplified expression. Let's go ahead and try the next one. The next one is more of multiplication. Because there's no sign in the middle or operation, we're going to multiply these. Remember from Monday, we learned how to multiply using FOIL, which you probably already knew how to do this, but it's just some good review. FOIL, so first, 3p times 3p is 9p squared. Because I have two p's that I'm multiplying, p squared is what we end up with. Let's go ahead and do, we did first, let's do outer. 3p times 2 is 6p. Just multiply and stick the p at the end. I stands for inner. Negative 2 times 3 is negative 6p. Then L stands for last. So I'm going to do negative 2 times positive 2, which is negative 4. Now I'm going to go through and just combine like terms if I can. 9p squared doesn't have anything to combine with it, so I'm going to draw an arrow. 9p squared. 6p and 6p, those can combine together, but 6 minus 6, that makes 0, so those are just going to go away. Because when we combine them together, they make 0, they just go away. And the minus 4 we can tack on at the end. And that is our simplified expression, 9p squared minus 4. Okay, now that we went ahead and did our bell work, let's go ahead and look at our notes for today. Today we're going to review greatest common factor, or GCF, and factoring by grouping. This is chapter R, so we're still in our review chapter, section R.3b. As we go throughout these notes, you can be taking notes either on your own or you can use the notes that I've attached onto Canvas. Just below this video, if you go back to the Canvas page, you'll see my guided notes, and those just kind of save you from having to write everything down. Makes it pretty easy to follow along. Let's go ahead and get started though. First, we're going to simplify. So reviewing what it meant to multiply and simplify expressions, we're going to take 4x and I'm going to distribute it to everything on the inside of those parentheses. So 4x times 3x squared. 4 times 3 is 12. Then I've got 2 x's here and 1 x to start with. So that becomes x to the third power. Right, 2 plus 1 is 3. Next, 4x and negative 10. 4 times negative 10 is negative 40. X times x is x squared, so I've got 2 x's. Then my last term, 4 times 5 is 20, and then I'm going to tack on my x at the end. So we have plus 20x, and that is our simplified polynomial expression. We can't combine like terms or anything else, so that's all that we're left with. So that was pretty much a review from what we did Monday and last week. Now we're going to kind of go backwards. So what we just talked about was distributing. Now we're going to talk about the opposite, which is called factoring. So that's your first blank on your notes. Factoring. Factoring allows us to decompose a polynomial into a product of factors. Okay, that's what factoring does. Distributing distributes it in, factoring splits it out. And then the greatest common factor, that's your next blank, known as the GCF. The greatest common factor. Throughout the lesson today, you'll hear me refer to it as the GCF. And that's what this means. Greatest common factor, GCF. Is the largest factor that divides the polynomial. Divides means that it goes in perfectly. No remainders, goes in perfectly. So let's see how this works with an expression. Factoring with the GCF. It says factor out the GCF. GCF is the greatest common factor. So first I find it helpful to go ahead and look at the numbers. The numbers, the coefficients in the front. 4, -6, and 20. So we want to think of the biggest thing, the greatest, that they're all divisible by. Greatest number that 4, 6, and 20 are all divisible by. Well, since they're all even, they're all divisible by 2. And 4 is divisible by 4, but 6, is that divisible by 4? No. So that's why we're going to divide all of these by 2. 2 was the biggest number they all were divisible by. So I'm going to divide everything by 2. But I also have some variables to look at. So when it comes to the variables, we want to pull out what they all have in common. It looks like they all have a p in common. This has 3 p's, 1 p, and 5 p's. So I can pull out 1 p out of everything. I can't pull out 2 because this one does not have 2 p's, just has 1. So I'm going to pull out 1 p out of everything. So we look at our q's. There's 4 q's here, 2 here, and 7 here. All of them have at least 2 that I can pull out. They all share at least 2, so I'm going to pull out 2 q's. And when we factor, we said this means to divide. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. 4 divided by 2 is 2. I had 3 p's, but I pulled 1 out, so I'm left with 2 p's. I had 4 q's, I pulled 2 out, so I'm left with 2 q's. Okay, so factoring is dividing the numbers and then pulling out the variables. Next one, -6 divided by 2 is -3. Then I've got a p here, but I pulled it out, so I don't have any p's right here. I'm just going to leave the next spot blank. Then same thing with the q's. I had 2 q's, but I pulled them both out, so I don't need a q next to the 3 because I already pulled out all the q's there were. Okay, next one, plus 20 divided by 2 is 10. I had 5 p's, but I pulled 1 out, so I'm left with 4. I had 7 q's, but I pulled 2 out, so I'm left with 5 q's. And that is our simplified expression. Okay, that's pulling out GCF. Find what the numbers are all divisible by, and then find with the variables how many you could pull out of each term. Okay, and then you just divide and put your answer in the parentheses. That's how you factor using the GCF. Let's try the next example. See, we're doing the exact same thing. We've got 4 terms this time, but that's okay. We can do the same thing with 4 terms. Find the GCF, the biggest thing that all the numbers are divisible by. So let's just focus on the numbers first. I find that easiest. 4, 12, 16, and 24. Well, they're all even, so they're all divisible by 2. Let's see that we want the greatest one. So it looks like 4 is divisible by 4. 12 is divisible by 4, 16 is divisible by 4, and 24 is divisible by 4. So 4 is going to be our greatest common factor. Now let's look at the variables. Well, I have an AX here, an X here, an A here, and nothing at the last term. Do they all have an A that they share? No, they don't. So I can't pull out an A because they do not all have an A. Do they all have an X that they share? No, they do not. So I can't pull out an X because they all do not have an X. Remember, they must be in common with each other to pull it out. Otherwise, you can't do anything with it. This one we said, though, we could divide by 4, so that's what I'm going to do. -4 divided by 4 is -1. Then I have to leave the a and the x because I didn't pull those out. So I leave them. 12 divided by 4 is 3, and leaving that x there as well. -16 divided by 4 is -4, leaving the a. And 24 divided by 4 is 6. And that is our simplified polynomial expression. Can't combine any more like terms. The inside piece, the green part, doesn't have a GCF, so I'm done with factoring. If you chose to do this problem and pull out the -4, that would have been okay too. You could have pulled out the negative and it would have gotten you the same answer. So you could have pulled out a -4 or a +4. Let's go ahead and try the next one, factoring out the GCF. This one looks a little bit different, but it's the same kind of setup. We're pulling out the greatest factor they have in common. Remember, factors mean that they're being multiplied together. So 10x is a factor, and 3x plus 4 is another factor. Then on the next one, -7 is a factor, and 3x plus 4 is another factor. What do you notice that they have in common? Right, they both share a 3x plus 4. So that's going to be my GCF. 3x plus 4 is my GCF that I'm going to pull out. So your GCF doesn't have to be just one number or one letter. It can be a whole group of things that you pull out. You do the same thing. I'm going to pull out 3x plus 4 out of the first term. And I'm left with 10x. I'm going to pull out 3x plus 4 out of the next term. And I'm left with a -7. And that is our simplified polynomial expression. Use factor by grouping or factoring out the GCF. All right, now let's move on to factor by grouping. Factor by grouping is very similar. It involves factor by grouping involves pulling out the GCF out of two terms and then grouping them back together. That's why this is called factor by grouping. You pull out the GCF and then you group them back together. So let's see how this is done. Just a side note, this is used when you have 4 terms. So if I say factor something in your directions and you've got 4 terms, you want to use this method. So let's do exactly what it says. I'm going to group the first 2 terms together and the last 2 terms together. That's why it's called grouping. Then I'm going to pull out the GCF out of those 2 terms, just like it says here. So as we look at the first group, 2ax minus 6ay. 2 and 6 are both divisible by 2. So I'm going to pull out a 2 out of both of those. Looks like they also share an a, so I'm going to pull out an a. I can't pull out an x though because there's not an x in both of them. And I can't pull out a y because there's not a y in both of them. So we're just going to write what's left. 2 divided by 2 is 1. I had an a, but I pulled it out, so there's no more. But I have my x still. Okay, let's do the next one. -6 divided by 2 is -3. I had an a, but I pulled it out. And then y is what's left. So if you need to pause the video, go ahead and do so if you need to pause it to see what I did. I just pulled out the GCF. Let's do it out of the last 2 terms. Because this is a negative in the front, I'm actually going to go ahead and pull out a -5 out of both terms. Anytime there's a negative in the front here, it's a good idea to go ahead and pull out that negative in your answer as well. So pull out a -5. I can't pull out an x or a y because they don't have it in common, so I'm going to divide. -5 divided by -5 is 1, leave my x. 15 divided by -5 is -3, leave my y. Okay? So first step is done. Grouping the terms, pull out their GCF. Last step is group them back together. So I'm going to take this outside piece and group them back together. 2a minus 5 And then take this inside piece, 1x minus 3y, 1x minus 3y, and group those back together as well. And that is our simplified polynomial. So that's how you factor by grouping. Group the first two terms together, pull out their GCF like we did here, and then group those back together. That's what the blue parentheses are. All right, let's go ahead and try another one. You get better at these factor by grouping problems as you do more of them. So let's try another one. 25x to the fourth minus 40x cubed plus 24x minus 2. This has 4 terms. So I'm going to go ahead and use factor by grouping. So we group the first 2 terms together and pull out what they have in common. 25 and 40 are both divisible by 5. That's their biggest thing. They're both divisible by. And then they also have 4 x's here, 3 x's here. So how many they have in common, how many they each have, is 3 that I can pull out. So I'm going to pull out 3 x's and just divide. 25 divided by 5 is 5. 4 x's, but I pulled out 3, I'm left with 1. Negative 40 divided by 5 is negative 8. I had 3 x's and I pulled out all 3, so I don't need an x next to the 8 because I pulled out all my x's already. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Plus 24 and 2, those are both divisible by 2. And they don't have an x in common, so I can't pull it out. 24 divided by 2 is 12. Leave my x. Minus 2 divided by 2 is 1. Okay, so if I'm going too fast through these problems, you can pause the video, slow it back down, rewatch it, whatever you need to do to make sure you understand it. Let's go ahead and finish this problem. First step, I grouped, I factored the GCF out, and now I'm going to group them back together. 5x cubed plus 2 gets together, and 5x minus 8, and 12x minus 1. The problem I'm going to run into is this 5x minus 8 is not the same as 12x minus 1. Because those are not the same, I cannot group them together. So it is not factorable. So this problem is not factorable because these 2 inside pieces that were inside the parentheses, they were not the same, like they were on the last problem. So I cannot factor this anymore. And if you ever run into that, that's what you would say as well, not factorable. Let's try one more and then we'll be done. You guys are doing great. Factor by grouping. On this one, let's see, it looks like I can, actually, let's look at all of them. 2, 16, 8, and negative 4. What are they all divisible by? Let's pull that out first out of all of them. Looks like they are divisible by 2, so we can pull out a 2. I can't pull out an A out of all of them because the 16 doesn't have an A with it. And I can't pull out a B because the 8A doesn't have a B with it. So I'm just going to divide everything by 2. I'm left with 1AB minus 16 divided by 2 is 8B plus 8 divided by 2 is 4A. Negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2B squared. Okay. So that's my first step. I went ahead and divided everything by that common factor of 2. Now let's see if we can do some grouping here on the inside. So the 2 is going to stay on the outside here. Now I'm going to look at the inside piece. 1 and 8, those are both divisible by 1, but nothing else. Looks like they have a B in common though, so I can pull out a B. And I'm left with A minus 8 on the inside of my parentheses. Plus, looks like the next one, 4 and 2 are both divisible by 2. They don't have an A or a B in common, so I'm just going to divide by 2. 4 divided by 2 is 2A minus 2 divided by 2 is 1b squared. Okay, and close those parentheses because of the 2 on the outside. But now let's notice something. This a minus 8 is not the same thing as this inside parentheses. So we may be tempted to say that this is not factorable, but let's actually try to reorder the terms and see if this works a little bit better if we just reorder our numbers. So I'm going to extend the page. I'm just going to draw a squiggly line so we can show that this step didn't work when we tried it once. But if you don't get it the first time, maybe let's try reordering it and see if it works. So 2ab plus 8a minus 16b minus 4b squared. Okay, so now let's try reordering it. Just a heads up, this is not a problem that would be on your test. This is just a problem to kind of make you think. Use your critical thinking skills to think about how we could do this another way. So same thing, I'm going to pull out a 2 out of everything. We're left with ab plus 4a minus 8b minus 2b squared. Just like we did on the last problem, pulled out a 2 first. Now I'm going to do the same thing, group them together. Group, group, and pull out what they have in common. Let's see, out of the first one, it looks like they have an a in common. So I'm going to pull out an a, and I'm left with b plus 4. Okay, well that worked out well for the first one. Let's do the next one. Negative 8 and negative 2, it's a negative, so I'm going to pull out a negative out of both of them. 8 and 2 are divisible by 2, so pull out negative 2. And I'm also going to actually pull out a b because they have at least one b in common with each other. So I'm going to pull out negative 2b. Negative 8 divided by negative 2 is 4. I already pulled out the b, so I'm not going to write it again. Negative 2 divided by negative 2 is 1. I already pulled out 1b, so I have 1b left over. Okay, and now we check and see if these look the same. This is b plus 4. This is 4 plus b, but remember that is the same thing because I can flip the order. And it's the same thing. So yes, they are the same. We can group them together. So bring down my 2 here. Then in goes a minus 2b. Remember, group the outsides together. And now I'm going to group that inside b plus 4. b plus 4. And that is our simplified polynomial.